Friends, peace be with you. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this lecture series, Focus on the Global South, for this very kind invitation. They're extremely hospitable. I'd also like to thank the Third World Studies Center of UP for playing host this afternoon. Thank you very much. And I apologize for this delay, for keeping you waiting. It was beyond our control. I'm really sorry about it. Now, the topic that we will be discussing this afternoon, the right of self-determination in ASEAN and the Philippines, can be approached from different angles. What I'm trying to do today, I shall look at it in terms of internal self-determination in relation to individual states within ASEAN, including the Philippines. And after that, share some of my thoughts about self-determination at the level of ASEAN as a collectivity, ASEAN as a regional entity. Let me begin with individual ASEAN states and the struggle of self-determination. The most obvious would, of course, be what's happening in the Philippines. Self-determination in relation to the Bangsamoro, and also, I suppose, in relation to the indigenous peoples. I should not be discussing this in great detail because I'm sure you know much more than I do about this particular aspect of self-determination. All that I will be able to do today is perhaps to raise some issues, try to answer some questions, and I would very much welcome your own thoughts on this very important challenge, the challenge of self-determination in the context of the Philippines. In the case of the indigenous peoples, I suppose one could argue that attempts to provide some sort of legal framework to the legitimate aspirations of the indigenous people, and this is something that had evolved over a period of time after independence. You have, for instance, the recognition of their autonomy and their rights of the indigenous people in the Cordilleras, Mindanao, and there have been court cases, there have been political campaigns on their behalf, and while there's been some success here and there, I think by and large, the indigenous peoples, in spite of certain provisions in the law, are confronted by a challenge which indigenous peoples are confronted by other situations, namely the challenge of vested interests that undermine what perhaps the law may allow for in certain circumstances. And here we are referring to vested interests connected with mining and logging and manufacturing and so on and so forth. I'm sure you're very much aware that this is something that confronts indigenous communities in other parts of ASEAN and also outside ASEAN. Very powerful vested interests of this sort. And I suppose in the long run, the only way in which you can overcome this is, one, through raising public awareness. In other words, you have to get other segments of society committed to the struggle of indigenous people in these areas, because on their own, they would not be able to overcome these stumbling blocks. You will have to make it into a mass campaign, and perhaps the time has come, since we're talking about ASEAN, to get peoples and communities in other ASEAN countries also involved in struggles like this, so that they would also be able to give their support to legitimate causes of this sort. I don't think much has been done in this respect, even though I know there is a bit of cooperation amongst groups fighting for the indigenous peoples within the ASEAN region, but it hasn't really gone very far. So that perhaps is what one can try to do in the long run. Let me add at this point that the struggle of indigenous peoples not just in the Philippines or in ASEAN, has a certain resonance at this juncture in history with what's been happening at the global level. Meaning by which, if you look at the environmental crisis, I suppose one can say that the indigenous people have something to tell us, something to offer to us, because they have had a philosophy, a worldview that values nature, that values the environment, natural resources, which has a very judicious approach to the use of natural resources. You know, that principle that is so important to indigenous peoples in Australasia, in various parts of Asia, and in the Americas, that you must always think of the seventh unborn generation. That sort of principle in terms of using natural resources for the present. Now these, I think, are important principles which we should bring to the fore at this juncture, especially because we confront this huge, this colossal environmental crisis. And I see the indigenous people as offering us lessons in yet another area. If you look at the economic crisis, even though I suppose one will not be able to apply principles from the lifestyles of indigenous people in relation to, say, the financial structure, nonetheless, when it comes to certain other aspects of the economy, the role of small communities, for instance, and the degree of control that small communities should exercise over resources, their own resources, and how one should organize resources at that level, at the grassroots level. Perhaps, again, indigenous people have something to offer in terms of values and principles that we can draw from their history and their lives and apply them to the present. The function of small communities, of decentralization, of grassroots economic organization, participation, and the rest of it. These are some general thoughts about the struggle of indigenous peoples in the context of the Philippines and in the larger context of ASEAN. As far as the Bangsa Moro are concerned, here again you have a struggle that has been going on for a very long while. Some historians will even argue that it began from the time of the Spaniards. This attempt to shape their own future, the Bangsa Moro, because they were a very significant civilization when the Spaniards arrived. And they were confronted by a totally different type of civilization. The Bangsa Moro, Muslims, who were also part of a much larger civilization, who traded with other communities, were ports, were a flourishing civilization at that time. Now the Bangsa Moro were asserting a principle that has been very, very important to humankind, that they would like to shape their own destiny. And they saw Spanish colonialism as a major obstacle. The Americans continued to ignore the rights and the destiny of the Bangsa Moro, and one could argue that even after independence, the emergence of an independent Philippine nation, the Bangsa Moro have, in a sense, resisted dominance. They've resisted control from Manila. Now, this struggle, with its very long history, has become very complex, partly because of various developments after independence and after the emergence of the Philippine state in its present form. Migration is one of the major factors, settlement, the dilution of the Bangsa Moro population in Mindanao, and how the entire demographics has changed quite dramatically. So here you have a situation where people are asserting their right to their ancestral domains, where they're talking about their resources and their history and what was their homeland. You're confronted by new realities, which will also have to be taken into account. How does one negotiate this? This is the major challenge. There have been attempts to recognize their autonomy. It's true, you've got the AAA Agreement of 1976. We have had the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao. We have had other attempts since then, including, I suppose, the Constitution of 1987 that recognizes genuine autonomy for the Bangsa Moro and indigenous peoples. We've had all these developments which are positive by and large, but nonetheless, in terms of implementation, it has always been problematic. Even if you look at AAA, the AAA agreement, it was never really implemented, and this is why it had given rise to a great deal of unhappiness on the side of the Bangsa Moro. And later attempts to, there have been accusations, allegations of a lack of sincerity. And on the part of the Bangsa Moro, you have had different groups emerging. And the fact that they are divided, that there have been all these tendencies within the Bangsa Moro, divisions and dichotomies and all the rest of it, that has, in a sense, weakened their own cause. It has weakened their own cause, it has made it difficult for them to struggle for homeland or to establish their autonomy. So we have now arrived at a point where all these very complex issues have come to the surface and people are beginning to feel that perhaps there's no solution to this challenge. Perhaps the only solution, some are saying, is a military solution, and others are saying maybe one has to work out something else which would capture the imagination of the Bangsa Moro itself, and also perhaps something which would give a fresh impetus to the state in trying to resolve this issue. And I've been hearing in the last couple of days since my arrival here, I've been hearing about perhaps a referendum as a way of resolving this issue, but we know that referenda have taken place in the past, including referenda linked to the AAA agreement. We are very much aware of what happened in the past. There are others who are talking about this new idea of a sub-state as a sort of regional government. But what does the sub-state mean in relation to the constitution of the Philippines? That is a major question. Does it require an amendment? There are people who are talking about a federal system of governance which would accommodate this notion of a sub-state. But these are ideas which one will have to explore, one will have to see what they will lead to in the long run. But for the time being, all I want to say is that one hopes that there will be some sort of resolution which would be just, which would be fair to both the minority, Bangsa Moro, and the majority community at the same time. And I don't think it is beyond the genius of Filipino people to come out with a solution of this sort, especially in a difficult time like this. Let me now turn to Thailand, the other country in ASEAN where we have also got a very serious challenge in relation to self-determination. And this would be the problem of the Malay Muslims of southern Thailand. 3 provinces which have a Malay Muslim majority in southern Thailand. And again, this is an ancient problem, if you like. Why do I say this? Because this is something that emerged in the last century, at the beginning of the 20th century, when a Muslim sultanate was annexed to a Buddhist kingdom. It was not part of that kingdom. It had nothing in common with that kingdom. It was just a case of annexation. It was the Sultanate of Patani that was annexed to the Buddhist Thai or Siamese kingdom at that time. It was possibly made part of that Siamese kingdom, and it has never really been integrated. It has never really accepted its status within that Buddhist majority kingdom, and this, I think, is the root of the problem. They're different in terms of their language, totally different, and I think this is what makes your situation less complicated compared to the Thai situation. Totally different language and history, culture, which is very, very different. they are in fact different, the Malay Muslims of the south, from the Muslims who had settled down in the central part of Thailand and the northern part of Thailand. Those Muslims are integrated into Thai society, but these Muslims in the south are not integrated. They are a separate community, they are separate people. And there have been honest attempts, I think, on the part of the Thai government, on the part of the Buddhist elite, to bring them into the mainstream. But there have also been attempts to keep them apart. There have been various instances of discrimination in the realm of religion, culture, education, jobs, and even in politics. They are represented, of course, in the Thai parliament, but if you look at their political role, it is minimal. If you look at the administrative role, you find that it's also minimal. They are not well represented in the police or the military, and so on and so forth. So they have grievances which are genuine, but at the same time, it raises larger questions. The struggle of the Malay Muslims of the South raises larger questions about the integration of a community that was on the outside into the mainstream. And perhaps they themselves have not attempted to adjust, which is sometimes the problem with minorities everywhere in the world. Sometimes they don't adjust, sometimes they don't reach out to the majority, and that also becomes a problem. So that's the example of Thailand, and here again there's no solution that is obvious to us, even though I think there is concern. People are trying to resolve the challenge. There are those who feel that the military aspect should be separated from the political aspect. There have been qualms that have been expressed about the fresh round of violence in southern Thailand. It had begun in 2004. There was a long lull, unlike your situation here, a very, very long lull, and then of course this fresh eruption of violence, which has, in a sense, become a major headache for all parties. Friends, this again is an example of people yearning for autonomy, some asking for secession. They want to be independent, others saying, well, the solution is autonomy within the framework of the Thai constitution, and we don't know whether that is possible at all. The other country which has faced the same sort of challenges, of course, Indonesia. If you look at Indonesian history, there was the question of Aceh. Again, a long-standing struggle, people wanting to establish an identity of their own, an identity linked to Islam and Islamic law and Islamic culture and all the rest of it. But today, the Aceh situation has been more or less resolved. And it was mainly through negotiations, not through violence, even though there had been quite a bit of violence in the past. But in the end, after the tsunami of 2004, I'm not saying the tsunamis are the solution, but sometimes when you have the natural disasters which have had a monumental impact, you find that people do come together and say, okay, now let's try to resolve the problem. And this is what happened between Jakarta and the people of Aceh. They have now worked out a solution of sorts. And of course, the other major issue involving the Indonesian state was Timor-Leste. What is today Timor-Leste, at that time East Timor, Timor. That was a major challenge. And here again, if you look at what had happened, there was a severe crisis that affected the Indonesian state in 1998. An economic crisis, also at the same time a political crisis, because the president was overthrown by a mass movement. President Suharto was overthrown in 1998, and then in January 1999, the person who succeeded President Suharto, President Habibie, announced that there would be a referendum. A referendum was held on the 30th of August 1999, and that referendum saw the people of Timor, East Timor, voting for independence, 78% of them. 78% of them. Now this again is very significant, friends. You find that in many instances, when you hold a referendum amongst the people affected by this struggle for self-determination, in many instances you find that the people support the idea of secession, of independence, of breaking away. And that happened in the case of Timor-Leste. they wanted to have their own state. And that is what has happened now. They've got an independent state. So I've given you these various examples. These are examples for us to reflect upon. I personally feel that secession, establishing a separate independent state, has its own challenges. It's not that easy. The most recent example would be the most recent member of the United Nations, Southern Sudan. Broke away from larger Sudan. Today you have the Sudan, the Republic of Sudan, and Southern Sudan. It was also the product of a referendum. They had a referendum, long-standing grievances, war, violence. In the end, it was resolved through a referendum. Overwhelmingly, the people of the South voted for independence. But I'm not saying that that is the solution in each and every case. I don't know whether that can work in the case of Bangsamoro. In my previous talks, I've been very honest about this. I feel that the creation of an independent state has both internal and external challenges. Internal challenge, of course, is its viability. We don't know. Some people say, never mind, let's just try it out. Maybe it will be viable. But then again, it depends on what one means by independence and how one is going to work that out. But there's also an external dimension to it, which I think is very important, and we must keep this in mind. What is the external dimension? Within ASEAN, I do not think there will be much support for the idea of an independent state. Why do I say this? I do not see Indonesia supporting such an idea because though you have the example of Timor-Leste, I think the Indonesian public as a whole and the government, they would prefer a solution which is more in the mode of Aceh. In other words, to get an autonomy but within the existing state. They were not happy with what had happened in Timor-Leste. Besides, even in the case of Indonesia, you know, there is a problem of Irian Jaya, still unresolved. So there are issues of that sort. I don't think Thailand would be happy with an independent state, Bangsamoro state in the Philippines, because they'll have to think about their own restive southern provinces. What are they going to do? Should they also become independent? Would they allow it? Even in Malaysia, even though Malaysia doesn't have the same sort of problems, but it may give ideas to people in Sabah and Sarawak, and I don't think Malaysians will be very happy about it, and I'm sure you know what the Sabah issue is in relation to Malaysia and the Philippines. So I think there are issues which one will have to grapple with. It's not very easy. Even outside ASEAN, China will not be very happy with this sort of secession because they too have problems with their western province, the Yuga, Tibet, and India also has problems. So this is something which many nation states are confronted with. So in terms of international legitimacy, it would be a challenge. This is why one should, I think, try to work out a solution within the framework of the existing state, whether it's in the case of Thailand or in the case of the Philippines. Autonomy, enhanced autonomy, regional government, sub-state, what have you, but within the existing framework. And this is something which all of us can try to contribute to, meaning by which academics, activists, other people in terms of ideas. Let me conclude, friends, by making some remarks about ASEAN as an entity and self-determination in the largest sense. We have talked about self-determination in the context of existing nation states. But there is another dimension to self-determination, which is different from the context of the nation state and different from the anti-colonial history of self-determination struggles. And what is that dimension that we're talking about? What does self-determination mean in the era of globalization? That is the question you have to ask. What does self-determination mean in the era of huge transnational and multinational corporations that exercise so much power? If self-determination means the ability to determine your own destiny, what does that mean in the era of huge multinationals and transnationals, and even more significant, in the era of your investment banks, your hedge funds, your huge, massive financial markets that transact trillions and trillions of dollars every day. And they determine our lives, our future. What does self-determination mean in that context? If self-determination means the right to shape your own destiny, doesn't have any meaning at all. So I think we must also address the question of self-determination from the perspective of the global age. What does it mean to not just nation states, communities, peoples everywhere? And not just in relation to economics, financial markets and economic systems and so on. What does it mean in relation to political decision making? For a community, a nation state, what does it mean in this global age? What does self-determination mean when you have dominant cultures that shape our futures? Cultures emerging and emanating from certain centers, and they shape our lives totally. What does self-determination mean? Because if we go back to the principle of self-determination enunciated in the UN Charter, at the heart of that principle is this notion of our ability as people, not just as nation states, mind you, as people, to shape our future, to shape our destinies. Is that possible today? Thank you very much.